The siren's wail ripped through the tranquil summer morning, an ugly counterpoint to the gentle lapping of the lake water against the hull of my old fishing boat. "Sir, on the lake, cut your engine now." The voice, amplified by a bullhorn, was crisp with authority, yet laced with an irritating impatience that grated on my last nerve. I ignored it, focused instead on the line I was steadily reeling in, the tension in the monofilament promising a decent catch. Beside me, Leo, my 10-year-old nephew, gripped his own rod, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was supposed to be a simple, peaceful fishing trip, a chance for him to escape the concrete jungle for a week, and for me to finally get some quiet time after a brutal winter of construction work. Instead, it was turning into a scene straight out of a bad reality TV show, a full-blown confrontation that, unbeknownst to me, would quickly escalate from a petty HOA dispute to a political firestorm involving the highest office in the state. The irony was almost comical, given the VIP I had unknowingly brought along for the day. A twist of fate I was about to discover with a gut-wrenching jolt. My name is Ethan Vance, and for the last 7 years, this small, man-made lake, Lake Willow Creek, has been my sanctuary. My little cottage, a fixer-upper I bought for a steal at $185,000 back in 2017, sits on a quarter-acre lot just off the main channel, a place I'd poured every spare penny and bead of sweat into. The HOA, or the Willow Creek Homeowners Benevolent and Restrictive Association, as they pompously called themselves, had been a constant low-grade hum of annoyance. But never anything like this. This felt different, infused with an almost personal animosity. And it centered, as it often did, around Mrs. Albright, the HOA president. A woman whose penchant for rules often eclipsed her sense of reason. Her personal conflict with me, rooted in a perceived slight from a community meeting last fall, would be a major undercurrent in the unfolding drama, revealing itself through subtle jabs and thinly veiled accusations, exposing the deep flaws in this micro-justice system. The stakes were already high for me, potentially losing access to my own lake, but they were about to skyrocket with the reveal of my distinguished guest, setting the stage for a dramatic turning point and a layered reveal of injustice. "Uncle Ethan, what's going on?" Leo's voice was a whisper, laced with genuine fear. He looked back at the approaching sheriff's patrol boat, its blue lights now flashing, reflecting a distorted dance on the water. Another boat, a sleeker, private vessel, bobbed a little further back, its occupants clearly observing the unfolding spectacle with smug satisfaction. I knew exactly whose boat that was. Mrs. Albright's. She rarely missed an opportunity for a public spectacle, especially when it involved enforcing the arbitrary dictates of her HOA. Buddy, just some folks who don't understand how to enjoy a Sunday morning. I tried to reassure him, though my jaw was clenched tight. I gave the reel one last heave, bringing a glistening 5-pound largemouth bass splashing into the net. "There we go. Dinner. Ethan Vance. This is your third warning." The bullhorn blared again, closer this time, the words distorted and aggressive. "You are operating an internal combustion engine on a designated electric-only zone, prepared to be boarded." My blood ran cold. Electric-only zone. That was a new one. I bought this boat, a small 16-foot aluminum Lund with a trusty 25 HP outboard, specifically because I loved the freedom of exploring the far reaches of the lake, an area that was definitely not electric-only according to the old bylaws. The thought of confronting Mrs. Albright's arbitrary rule changes, especially those driven by what felt like personal vindictiveness, was already a familiar battle. And this was only just beginning to expose the systemic injustice embedded in these community systems. My urgent quest for justice was quickly shifting from a simple fishing trip to defending my right to enjoy my own property, which I'd fought hard for. This felt like a direct assault on my livelihood and peace of mind. I finally cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening after the continuous drone. The sheriff's boat glided up alongside, its hull bumping gently against mine. A deputy, young, stern-faced, and sporting a freshly trimmed buzz cut, glared down at me from behind dark sunglasses. His partner, older, with weary eyes, remained seated, watching Mrs. Albright's boat with a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. I caught the gesture, a flicker of something that hinted at a deeper, unspoken conflict within the system itself, a bias perhaps, or just plain exhaustion from dealing with HOA dramas. It wasn't a courtroom, but this confrontation felt every bit as charged, laying the groundwork for how societal prejudice could influence even local law enforcement, impacting my urgent quest for justice, license, and registration. "Sir," the young deputy demanded, his voice devoid of any courtesy. "You know the rules, Vance. This entire channel, from Marker 7 down to the Cove, has been designated electroconly since June 1st. Ordinance 23B, passed by the HOA and approved by the County Zoning Board last month." My hands were still slick from the fish, my heart thudding against my ribs. Ordinance 23B, I never received any notification about that. The official bylaws, the ones I have a copy of, clearly state that only the northernmost finger of the lake is electroconly. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. "Mr. Vance," the deputy countered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Now, your license and registration." I fumbled for my wallet, my frustration bubbling. This was a classic Mrs. Albright move, pushing through some obscure, barely publicized amendment, then swooping in to catch anyone unawares. It was always about control, about making her presence felt. The way this confrontation was playing out, with the deputy's disrespectful tone and the implicit profiling, only heightened the stakes, pushing me further into the role of the wrongly accused. The injustice was blatant, and the need to expose the truth about her motivations and the flawed process became paramount as I handed over my documents. Leo, sensing the tension, nudged the man sitting quietly in the back of my boat. The man who, until this point, had been almost invisible, patiently baiting a hook and occasionally offering gentle fishing advice, leaned forward. He was dressed simply, in a faded baseball cap and a plain t-shirt. His face weathered but kind, his eyes sharp and observant. He was here for a weekend retreat, a chance to decompress from the pressures of his incredibly demanding job, and had asked for no special treatment, just a quiet escape. He looked every inch the unassuming everyman, which was precisely the point of his incognito visit. A secret I had unwittingly, and now quite publicly, compromised. "Deputy," the man said, his voice calm, resonant, and carrying an undeniable weight of authority that cut through the deputy's bluster. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Vance operates in good faith. I've been fishing on this lake with him for several hours, and he's been nothing but respectful of the environment and the other residents." The deputy glanced at the man, his eyes narrowing slightly behind the sunglasses. He clearly didn't recognize him, nor did Mrs. Albright, who was now drifting closer in her own boat, her face a mask of triumphant vindictiveness. This was the moment where assumptions would begin to shatter, and the truth about my guest's identity would introduce the first major twist. The hidden personal conflict of Mrs. Albright, her bias against me, would be tested against a force she could not comprehend, transforming a simple HOA dispute into a much larger, more public reckoning. "Sir, if you're interfering with an officer's duties, you could be cited for obstruction," the deputy warned, though a hint of uncertainty flickered across his face. He seemed to sense something was off, but couldn't place it. He was operating under the assumption that he was dealing with two ordinary citizens, one of whom was a known problem in the community. This moment, raw and charged with disrespect, foreshadowed the larger consequences to come. "I assure you, Deputy, I am only seeking clarity," the man replied, his tone firm, unyielding. He then reached into his own pocket, pulling out a slim leather wallet. From it, he produced a card and extended it towards the deputy. "My apologies for not introducing myself sooner. I prefer to keep a low profile when I'm on personal time, but given the circumstances, I believe it's important for you to understand who you're speaking with." The deputy took the card, his initial dismissive smirk fading as his eyes scanned the official seal. His face went utterly blank, then flushed a deep crimson. The stern, confident posture crumbled, replaced by a rigid, almost paralyzed stance. He suddenly looked very, very young. Mrs. Albright, who had drifted within earshot, was now a mere 10 feet away, her face alight with self-satisfaction. Well, Ethan Vance, seems like your little guest is going to get you into even more trouble," she sneered, her voice carrying across the water. "Always pushing the limits, aren't you? This lake isn't your personal playground. We have rules for a reason. Rules that I championed to protect our property values and maintain order. This is a private community, not a free-for-all." Her words hung in the air, thick with contempt, and then, slowly, she saw the look on the deputy's face. The other sheriff's deputy, the older, weary one, had now stood up, his hand on his partner's shoulder, staring at the card with an expression of profound shock. The young deputy cleared his throat, his voice suddenly several octaves higher, almost a squeak. "Sir Governor, my deepest apologies. Governor Harrison, I had no idea." The words hung in the air, suspending time. Mrs. Albright's triumphant smirk dissolved, her jaw going slack. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, darted from the deputy to the card, to the unassuming man in my boat. She looked like she'd been slapped. Leo, bless his innocent heart, simply looked confused. He whispered, glancing at the man who had patiently taught him how to tie a clinch not just an hour ago. Governor Harrison nodded politely, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "It's quite all right, Deputy. No harm done. Though I do believe there might be some confusion regarding these new regulations. Perhaps we could discuss them. And perhaps, Deputy, you could also explain to Mrs. Albright here the finer points of community engagement and notification protocols before enacting such sweeping changes." His voice remained calm, but the underlying steel was unmistakable. This was a critical moment, the turning point where assumptions were shattered, and the true power dynamics of the situation were revealed. The deputy, now visibly trembling, stammered, "Why, yes, Governor. Of course, Governor. Right away, Governor." He practically saluted, then turned to Mrs. Albright, his face a mixture of fear and newfound resolve. The hidden personal conflict and bias of Mrs. Albright, her deeply flawed interpretation of justice, were about to be exposed under the harsh glare of real authority, making her confront the consequences of her actions. This confrontation was not in a courtroom, but it served as a much more public and immediate reckoning. This wasn't just about a fishing trip anymore. This was about power, abuse of authority, and the swift, unexpected consequence of underestimating the little guy. It was about a hidden personal conflict escalating into a state-level issue, demonstrating how systemic injustice often hides in plain sight, masquerading as petty bureaucracy. My urgent quest for justice, born from a simple desire for peace, had just become far more influential than I could have ever imagined, driven by the unwitting presence of the state's most powerful figure. The ripple effect of this confrontation would extend far beyond the calm waters of Lake Willow Creek. The afternoon sun beat down, turning the surface of Lake Willow Creek into a shimmering, oppressive mirror. The confrontation, which had begun with such aggressive bravado from the deputy and Mrs. Albright, had evaporated into a tense, almost silent exchange of formalities. Governor Harrison, after graciously accepting the deputy's profuse apologies and a slightly less sincere one from Mrs. Albright, had suggested we return to the dock to clarify the situation with all parties present. This was his understated way of saying, "Let's take this show on the road, and you, Mrs. Albright, are going to explain yourself." Back at the small community dock, a few curious residents had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of a sheriff's boat, Mrs. Albright's boat, and my beat-up fishing vessel all converging. The buzz of whispers followed us as we disembarked. Leo, still a little wide-eyed, stuck close to my side. He didn't fully grasp the magnitude of the situation, but he understood that something important had just happened, and it involved the kind man who'd helped him bait his hook, Mr. Vance. "If you wouldn't mind," Governor Harrison said, his tone still perfectly level, yet carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "Perhaps you could walk us through the established regulations you were aware of when you purchased your property." I nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline. This was my chance. This was the moment where my innocence, my long-standing frustration with the HOA's arbitrary power, could finally be laid bare. I retrieved a thick, worn binder from my boat, the one containing all my closing documents, property deeds, and, crucially, the original HOA bylaw. The sun glinted off the plastic cover, highlighting the title, Willow Creek Homeowners Association, established 2005, when I bought my cottage in 2017. I began, my voice clear and firm. I was given this document. It clearly states, on page 14, Section 3, Paragraph C, internal combustion engines are permitted on Lake Willow Creek, with the exception of the designated North Inlet Conservation Zone, identified by buoys 1 through 6, marked on the attached navigational map. My boat, as you saw, was well outside that zone, operating in what has always been the general access area. I opened the binder to the specified page, tapping the relevant paragraph. The deputy, whose name I now knew, was Officer Miller. Hovered awkwardly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the comfortable breeze. His partner, Deputy Jenkins, the older officer, stood slightly apart, observing Mrs. Albright with a look that spoke volumes of past grievances and a deep understanding of her character. Mrs. Albright. Governor Harrison turned to her, his gaze unwavering. Could you explain this discrepancy? Officer Miller mentioned a new ordinance to 3B. Enacted this past June 1st, Mr. Vance states he was never informed. And his copy of the bylaws contradicts this new rule. Mrs. Albright, usually so imperious, was visibly flustered. Her face, still a shade paler than usual, twitched with nervous energy. Well, Governor, with all due respect, Mr. Vance is always causing trouble. He's a known agitator. He probably received the notice and simply chose to ignore it, as he does with many of our community initiatives. We sent out an email blast, posted flyers at the community center, and even put a notice in the monthly newsletter. Her voice, though trying to regain its usual authoritative cadence, wavered slightly. This was her deeply entrenched bias against me, finally brought into the open. A classic example of societal prejudice impacting a character who was wrongly accused. An email blast, flyers, a newsletter. Governor Harrison raised an eyebrow, his tone still polite, but now with a sharp edge. Mrs. Albright, Mr. Vance's primary residence, according to county records, is not within the Willow Creek community. He owns a secondary property here, a cottage he uses for leisure. Did you confirm his communication preferences? Did you send a certified letter to his primary address, as required by state law for significant changes to property covenants? Mrs. Albright stiffened. Well, we assumed most residents are full-time. It's an oversight, perhaps. But the rule stands. It was voted on by the board. To preserve the tranquility of our lake, to protect the wildlife, to enhance the property values of our deserving residents. She cast a pointed, venomous glance at me, revealing the personal conflict that fueled her actions. The accusation, wrapped in a veneer of community welfare, highlighted the injustice of her profiling Mrs. Albright. Deputy Jenkins, the older officer, interjected softly, stepping forward. With all due respect, the county zoning board's approval was contingent on all property owners being given proper, documented notification. An email blast is simply not sufficient for a material change to property rights, especially when the board is aware that many owners maintain secondary residences here. We've had issues with this before. Officer Miller, looking like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole, nodded frantically. Yes, Governor, Deputy Jenkins is correct. Our internal review of the approval process highlighted this. We advised the HOA to ensure proper mail notification, but we don't enforce their internal communication methods. He avoided looking at Mrs. Albright, clearly having been pressured by her in the past. This subtle interaction revealed the systemic flaws, demonstrating how bias and influence could bypass proper procedure. Governor Harrison turned back to me. Mr. Vance, did you receive any formal mailed notification of this new ordinance? No, Governor, I stated unequivocally. Not a single letter. My primary residence is an hour's drive from here. I only check the community center postings when I'm here, which is mostly on weekends or for longer trips like this. My email address on file with the HOA is primarily for billing, and I didn't see any urgent notifications from them in June. I knew I hadn't. I'd been on a particularly demanding construction project. Working long hours, emails were the last thing on my mind, so, to be clear, the governor summarized, his voice now colder, sharper. The HOA, under Mrs. Albright's direction, enacted a significant change to property usage, failed to properly notify all affected property owners as required by state law, and then called law enforcement on one of those unnotified owners, leading to a public confrontation and a potential citation. He paused, letting the implications sink in. And this was all done under the guise of tranquility and property values, despite being implemented without due process. Mrs. Albright sputtered, trying to regain control. But he was speeding last fall, Governor, and he lets his nephew fish off the main dock without supervision. He's always bending the rules. She was grasping at straws, trying to pull in any previous perceived transgression to justify her current actions, exposing her hidden personal conflict. These unsubstantiated accusations were clear examples of disrespect and profiling, aimed at discrediting me and deflecting from her own misconduct. those are separate matters. Mrs. Albright, and frankly, irrelevant to the present discussion, Governor Harrison cut her off, his patience clearly wearing thin. What we have here is a clear case of an HOA overstepping its authority, failing to adhere to legal notification requirements, and then weaponizing local law enforcement against a resident for noncompliance with an uncommunicated rule. This isn't about fishing or agitating. This is about due process, property rights, and the fair application of community governance. He then turned to Deputy Jenkins and Officer Miller, deputies under state law, specifically Title 34, Article 7, Section 12B. Any changes to property covenants that restrict usage must be communicated via certified mail to all deeded property owners at their registered address, with a minimum of 30 days' notice prior to implementation. If this was not done, then Ordinance to 3B is at best unenforceable and at worst legally void. The two deputies exchanged a look. Officer Miller was mortified. Deputy Jenkins, however, gave a slight nod. "That's correct, Governor. And we've had issues with the HOA's notification procedures before. They often rely on informal methods, which always leads to these kinds of disputes." He looked at Mrs. Albright, a flicker of something like grim satisfaction in his eyes. It was clear this wasn't the first time he'd had to deal with her arbitrary enforcement and the systemic flaws it created within the community. In that case, Governor Harrison continued, his gaze sweeping across the small crowd of residents who were now listening intently. "I believe Mr. Vance is entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. He was operating his vessel under the understanding of the previously established and properly communicated bylaws. Any citation issued would be baseless and would not stand in court." He paused, then added, "And speaking of courts, Mrs. Albright, I strongly suggest your HOA board reviews its legal obligations. The state takes a dim view of organizations that undermine property rights and abuse their authority in this manner." He turned to me, a warm, genuine smile, replacing his earlier stern expression. "Ethan, thank you for a wonderful, if eventful, fishing trip. That bass looks like it's going to make a fantastic dinner. And Leo, you did a great job today. Maybe next time we'll catch an even bigger one, without the interruptions." He winked at Leo, who finally broke into a small, relieved smile. The scene, which had started with such public humiliation for me, had now completely flipped. Mrs. Albright stood there, defeated, her attempts to maintain her composure failing spectacularly. Her hidden personal conflict, her bias, and abuse of power had been exposed not by a courtroom, but by a direct public confrontation with an unexpected authority figure. It was a clear demonstration of how overlooked evidence, my unnotified status, and the outdated bylaws, combined with personal confrontation, shattered assumptions, and revealed the truth of my innocence and moral strength. But the story wasn't over. The governor's presence had shone a spotlight on a deeper issue, a systemic flaw in how the HOA operated and the way such entities could wield unchecked power over ordinary citizens. This incident, initially a petty fishing dispute, had now escalated into a much larger conversation about fairness, accountability, and human dignity within community governance. The immediate resolution delivered a measure of justice, but the larger challenge of reflection critically on these themes remained. The governor, with a quiet nod to his security detail who had materialized seemingly out of nowhere, indicated that our impromptu gathering was drawing to a close. Yet, the reverberations of this summer morning's events were only just beginning to spread across the community, and potentially the state. The next steps would involve not just the retraction of the false accusation against me, but a comprehensive review of the HOA's practices, pushing for a legal or emotional resolution that would challenge assumptions and demand a critical reflection on themes of fairness and accountability, ensuring that such injustice would not happen again. The immediate confrontation was resolved, but the larger battle for systemic change was just beginning. The governor's departure was as understated as his arrival. A quiet nod to his security detail, a firm handshake with me, and a final, reassuring pat on Leo's shoulder. Yet, the air around Lake Willow Creek thrummed with the aftershocks of his intervention. Mrs. Albright, pale and tight-lipped, was quickly ushered away by a mortified Officer Miller, while Deputy Jenkins lingered, offering me a genuinely apologetic look. "Ethan," he said, his voice low, "I'm truly sorry you had to go through that. We've been trying to get the HOA to clean up their act for years, but Albright has a way of influencing things. He gave me a knowing glance. This time, though, I think things might actually change. I watched the sheriff's boat pull away, carrying not just the officers and a chastened Mrs. Albright, but also the visible weight of her public undoing. Leo, now fully relaxed, skipped to my side. "So, Uncle Ethan, we can still fish here, right? With the motor." I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Absolutely, buddy, and probably with fewer interruptions from now on." The immediate crisis was averted, my fishing rights restored, and Mrs. Albright's arbitrary power momentarily curbed. But the governor's parting words had echoed in my mind. The larger challenge of reflection critically on these themes remained. The governor, with a quiet nod to his security detail who had materialized seemingly out of nowhere, indicated that our impromptu gathering was drawing to a close. Yet, the reverberations of this summer morning's events were only just beginning to spread across the community, and potentially the state. The next steps would involve not just the retraction of the false accusation against me, but a comprehensive review of the HOA's practices, pushing for a legal or emotional resolution that would challenge assumptions and demand a critical reflection on themes of fairness and accountability, ensuring that such injustice would not happen again. The immediate confrontation was resolved, but the larger battle for systemic change was just beginning. He was right. This wasn't just about my boat. It was about the fundamental rights of property owners, the transparency of community governance, and the very real dangers of unchecked authority. My initial relief quickly morphed into a quiet determination. This was an opportunity handed to me on a silver platter by a benevolent governor to ensure no one else would suffer under Mrs. Albright's petty tyranny. The ripples of that Sunday morning confrontation spread quickly, not just across Lake Willow Creek, but throughout the local county, and even into state political circles. Within days, my phone began to ring incessantly. Reporters from local papers, then regional news channels, all wanted my side of the story. I agreed to a few interviews, carefully framing the narrative not as a personal vendetta against Mrs. Albright, but as a broader issue of accountability and due process within HOAs. I showed them my outdated bylaws, my lack of certified mail notifications, and calmly recounted the morning's events, highlighting the governor's unexpected intervention. The public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly supportive. Many residents, both within Willow Creek and in other HOA-governed communities, shared similar stories of arbitrary rules, ignored complaints, and the feeling of helplessness against powerful, often unelected boards. Mrs. Albright, meanwhile, became a pariah. Her attempts to spin the story, claiming I was disruptive and that the governor had been misinformed, fell flat. Deputy Jenkins' quiet confirmation to several reporters that the sheriff's department had indeed flagged the HOA's notification methods in the past only solidified the public's perception of her as an abusive figure. The HOA board, under immense pressure, called an emergency meeting. I was formally invited, as were a number of other residents who had previously faced similar issues. The meeting hall, usually sparsely attended, was packed. News cameras waited outside. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, a mix of apprehension and eager anticipation. Mrs. Albright, looking noticeably aged and stripped of her usual hauteur, sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other board members, most of whom avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was a thin shadow of its former commanding self. She mumbled apologies, blamed miscommunications, and attempted to explain away the lack of proper notification as an administrative oversight. It was clear her reign was over. What followed was a cascade of revelations. Other residents, emboldened by the governor's intervention and the ensuing media scrutiny, stepped forward. Mr. Henderson, whose prize-winning rose bushes had been ripped out because they supposedly violated a new landscaping guideline he was never informed of, spoke passionately. Ms. Dubois, a single mother who had been fined repeatedly for a noise violation she later proved was her neighbor's fault, tearfully recounted her struggle. Each story painted a damning picture of an HOA board, specifically Mrs. Albright, operating with a blatant disregard for due process and driven by personal biases. I, too, spoke, reiterating my concerns about the systemic issues, the lack of transparency, and the potential for abuse of power. I suggested a complete overhaul of the HOA's communication protocols, a review of all recently enacted ordinances, and perhaps most importantly, a restructuring of the board itself, with term limits and clearer pathways for resident grievances. The meeting concluded with a motion of no confidence against Mrs. Albright, which passed unanimously, even with the votes of the other board members. She resigned on the spot, her face a mask of bitter defeat. The other board members, perhaps hoping to salvage their own positions, agreed to a full audit of all bylaws and finances, and to hold new elections within 2 months. It was a victory, but I knew it was just the first step. Over the next few weeks, I found myself unexpectedly thrust into the role of an advocate. Residents approached me constantly, sharing their stories, asking for advice. My little cottage, once a quiet sanctuary, became a hub of community engagement. I worked with Deputy Jenkins, who provided invaluable insights into the county's expectations for HOA governance. He even introduced me to a pro bono legal team specializing in property law, who offered to help guide the Willow Creek HOA through its restructuring. Together, we drafted new, clearer bylaws, established robust communication protocols that required certified mail for all significant changes, and created an independent ombudsman position to mediate disputes before they escalated. We introduced mandatory ethics training for board members and term limits to prevent entrenchment. The goal was not to dismantle the HOA, but to transform it into a truly benevolent and restrictive association, one that served its community fairly and transparently. The new elections were held 2 months later. I had initially resisted the idea of running for the board, preferring to remain an outside advocate, but after much encouragement from my neighbors and the realization that direct involvement was necessary to truly ensure lasting change, I decided to put my hat in the ring. To my surprise, I was elected to the new HOA board. Alongside several other residents who shared a commitment to fairness and accountability, the irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had fought the HOA was now part of its leadership. Tasked with rebuilding it from the ground up, my first task as a new board member, alongside the newly elected president, Mr. Henderson, was to officially retract Ordinance to 3B. The Electric Conley Zone reverted to its original, smaller designation. My 25 HP outboard was once again welcome on the main channels of Lake Willow Creek. The small victories, like seeing my boat cut across the water, its engine humming without fear of confrontation, brought a deep sense of satisfaction. Leo came to visit again the following summer. The lake felt different. There was a subtle shift in the community's mood, a palpable sense of relief and renewed trust. People waved to each other more, children played freely on the docks, and the once frequent arguments about petty violations seemed to have vanished. On a warm afternoon, Leo and I were out on the lake casting lines near the old fishing spot where it all began. The sun was warm on our faces, the gentle lapping of the water against the hull a peaceful rhythm. No sirens, no bullhorns, just the quiet hum of my outboard as we trolled slowly. "Uncle Ethan," Leo asked, reeling in a small bluegill, "what happened to Mrs. Albright?" I paused, thinking. "Well, buddy, she moved away. Sold her house a few months after all that happened. I heard she moved to a bigger city, said she preferred more urban living." I chuckled softly. "Guess she wasn't a big fan of transparency and accountability." Leo nodded, seemingly satisfied. But sometimes, mean people teach us important lessons, don't they? About standing up for what's right and making sure everyone gets a fair shake. He looked at me, a thoughtful expression on his young face. "So, you made the rules fair now." "We're trying our best," I said, pulling up my line to check the bait. "It's a lot of work, but it's worth it. It's about making sure everyone feels like they belong here, and that their voices are heard." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, I sat on my porch, a sense of profound peace settling over me. The old cottage, once a battleground, now truly felt like a sanctuary. It wasn't just my property anymore. It was a testament to the idea that even the smallest, most localized injustices could be challenged, and that ordinary people, when given the chance, could bring about extraordinary change. The quiet hum of the crickets, the distant splash of a fish, and the gentle breeze rustling through the willow trees by the creek. It was all perfect. The journey had been unexpected, difficult, and at times intensely frustrating. But in the end, it had delivered something far more valuable than a simple fishing trip: a renewed faith in fairness, accountability, and the enduring power of human dignity. And for that, I knew I would forever be grateful for the day I unknowingly took the governor fishing.